Hey there guys, welcome back to another video. My name is Daniel Lang, and in this one we're going to be looking at how I did this digital painting of O'Craig's Run from Red Dead Redemption 2. And just before I get into the time-lapse, I want to talk about my references and the research that I did before approaching a painting like this. I always think it's really important to think about what you're actually trying to achieve and spending some time thinking about things and writing things out and sketching if you have to. It's only going to make the final painting better in the long run. So let's have a look at my references here. And now that Red Dead Redemption 2 has an awesome photo mode into it, I've been able to use this tool to get some really nice shots and also turn things into paintings later on if I wanted to. I've been going through and taking pictures of everything that I find beautiful in the game, which is actually just the whole game. So this particular place, O'Craig's Run, has a really tranquil feel to it. And it's something that I can't really describe, but it's always such a relaxing place to be in. And so I felt like I wanted to capture that in my art. So why paint O'Craig's Run? Why paint Red Dead Redemption 2? Isn't it just a video game? Isn't it more beneficial to go out and paint things from life? Well, I think this is my own opinion, but learning from anything is beneficial. Finding your favorite game, or even movie stills or anything that catches your eye, that looks nice, should definitely be used to study. And at the end of the day, that's really what this is. It's just an art study. I'm using this as a tool for myself just to learn how certain relationships work within a landscape painting. The colors, for instance, the lighting, how distance and atmosphere can affect rendering detail. And I'm keeping all of this in my mind as I approach this painting. And as you guys can see here from my references, this one image in particular that I took in photo mode serves to be my anchor. And a lot of things here I'm trying to replicate. But there are a couple of changes that I've made. Particularly, the main one is the aspect ratio. Because Red Dead Redemption is a game, it's going to be in standard HD, 16:9. But I've decided to paint mine at more of an A3 landscape. Because of that, it's going to compress a couple of different things, and so I have had to kind of rework the composition. It's a fine line balancing this, because I do still want it to be recognizably Red Dead, and so I don't want to change anything too drastic. So in the end, the only thing that I really did omit from the reference is that bush on the left, also that rock just in front of Arthur Morgan, and I've also added a couple of fish and just a few birds flying in the distance. The other sorts of references that I have are things from life. So these images here were taken from Google and Pinterest and are very similar scenes that I have for myself. So distant mountains, a lake, that sort of thing, sunny day. But also, one thing that's important to note is I have a couple of references from Andrew Tischler, who is a fantastic artist, and I really love his work, especially his oil paintings of landscapes. And he always manages to incorporate a sense of grandness and epicness into it, and it's really awesome to look at. So I'm using this to identify certain brushstrokes or artistic embellishments that I can use in my own work. Okay, but enough about references, let's move on to the actual time-lapse. And now it's going a little bit fast, but I'll explain what I'm doing and hopefully you guys will be able to follow along. Right now I've chosen the actual resolution of my canvas that's going to be blown up, and I've made 3 of them, and basically just doing really quick thumbnail sketches. Changing very small things, but it's a way for me to think. It's not really for anybody else, and so as you can see there, I got rid of the bush, added some logs and rocks instead, and just playing around with it. Also just checking out the composition, and once that's done, I blow up the thumbnail into my final composition here. And so just trying to get a sense of placement for all the different elements within the scene. Starting very loose, very open, referring to the rule of thirds just to make sure that there's some kind of order in the chaos, I suppose. The underpainting that you see there is actually an old painting of mine, but I just got a bunch of textured brushes and went crazy with it just to have some kind of grit and texture into the painting. At the end though, I don't really think this method works well for me. I usually tend to approach things a little bit more simple by blocking in and having an actual warmer underpainting. But it was fun to try it anyway. And right now I am just throwing in some very basic sky colors, just working from the background and slowly towards the viewer. But as you can see later on in the time lapse, I tend to develop my entire painting as a Polaroid image. So I go back and forth between everything and make sure everything's at the same level before I move on to adding extra detail. And this can work. Sometimes it's a bit difficult because I feel like my attention span is always pulled between a lot of different areas. But I'm just still trying to find something that works well for me. Most of the detail ends up going to the focal point anyway, but I want everything to at least be on the same page before I start pulling the viewer's eye in a certain direction. But yeah, usually the start of a painting, maybe like the first half an hour to an hour, is really the most important part. Essentially what you're doing is putting a lot of the blueprints and the guidelines and foundations, so once it comes down to rendering, which is arguably one of the easier bits of a painting, you've got everything there and you don't really have to think so much about the design or the colors or anything. You have something that you can work with and you can continue on with that as far as you want. Oh, and one thing I actually forgot to mention during the line art stage is that in landscape paintings in general, the most important line on the page is the horizon line. And so you can see that I've positioned it right where Arthur Morgan's eye level is. And that's only because if we were, say, a cameraman behind him, that's where our eye line would be as well. So basically, the horizon line, anything above it is what we're looking up at, anything below it is what we're looking down at. At this stage, when I'm looking at my reference, the main thing that I'm thinking about is values and color accuracy, which are linked. In a landscape painting, as things get further away from the viewer, they tend to take on more of a bluey, purpley sort of tinge, and that's because of the atmosphere that's in the distance. So by having value control, I'm making things lighter in the background, and as they get closer towards us, like that cabin on the left-hand side, for example, and now Arthur Morgan, it's going to be a very dark value. If you can see up at the top right at my colorist wheel, pay attention to that and just see how I'm shifting things as I work back and forth between the image. A very simple block in here for Arthur Morgan, not really concerned with accuracy in terms of proportions at this point. I just want to have something there so I can relate the other things in the painting back to it. At this stage, it might be very, very tempting to zoom in and start detailing stuff, but it takes a little bit of discipline, but ultimately it helps you in the long run. And so just staying zoomed out, keeping an eye on everything is a very, very good idea. Most of the details come right at the end, and that can be therapeutic in itself. But for right now, as much as I want to, I need to keep zoomed out. If you're a beginner artist, and if you're using Photoshop and learning about digital painting, I really encourage you to take things slow when you do art studies, and just to relax and have fun with it. If things are getting a little bit too frustrating, take a break. Art's not really supposed to be a grind, and I think that that's the fastest way to kill your motivation. So it's alright, and just enjoy the process, try and learn something. And for me particularly, this painting was actually quite difficult to get out. I painted this over 3 days, and even though the time lapse is, one entire video, I of course took breaks in between. That's very, very important. But for some reason, my attention was just all over the place, like I mentioned earlier. And whether that was from the new technique, or maybe I just wasn't really into it that day, not really sure. But it's important to learn from failures and things that don't really go well, because in the future, it's really just going to help you. You can always try a whole bunch of different stuff, but you don't know what you don't know, and so some techniques might work well, some might not, and the fun of it is really just the experimentation, finding something that you like to do, and then that sort of becomes your own style. you guys look on the right hand side and see my layers, I want to use this now as an opportunity to talk about layer management, because that's also something that you should at least be aware of when you're working on digital paintings. For something like this, which is more of again, an art study, it's fine not to have too many layers, and most of it is just stacked on top of each other, so I'm not really going back to a layer once I've started working on something new. At this moment, it's really more of a confidence thing, so if I see something that works, then I will add as few layers as possible. If I'm experimenting with something and trying out different colors, I might create a new layer, but once it does work, I will crunch it back down into the layer below. That's really just keeping things organized and clean for me. It might be different if you're working on a commission or some sort of concept art, because you need to be able to rework things like that. So for now in this painting, layers isn't really that important. So I just want to give you guys a bit more information about this painting. It was painted over 3 days, as I mentioned earlier, but the time-lapse itself is about 12 hours in total, and shrunken down to half an hour. And although I haven't really been demonstrating the techniques that I have been doing, I do want to touch upon one of them, which is implied detail. So what exactly is implied detail? Well, rather than painting every single leaf or rock or bird that goes through with all the little feathers and stuff, it's more about suggesting certain things with color and tone and values. And to achieve this, I'm using a combination of different brushes, which I'll show you guys now. And so in my brush panel in Photoshop, you can see that I've got a whole bunch of brushes here, and I really don't use like 99% of these ever. I only use maybe 10. The main thing is, when it comes to brushes, isn't really the specific brush that I'm using, it's actually what I'm looking for in a brush. And that just comes with experience. But when I'm using these brushes in a painting, I'll find all these different ones that I've downloaded online and just chuck them up here in the general brush tab. And this is really just for easy access, so I can come back and keep using the ones that I use often. You can see here that I've got, the first one is this watercolor brush. And it's really nice because it has a sense of, it's got this transparency to it, as you can see here, and it's great for sketching things too. You can see that it's very loose, very open, and I tend to do that when I'm blocking in things at the very, very beginning. So this skull here, you can see it's still got a lot of soft edges around it, and I'll come in and just try and add a little bit more definition and try and block in some basic values and stuff. But it's meant to be very loose, and it's meant to give me some sort of starting point so that I can come back in with this next brush called the MH8B brush 57, very, very specific, but it's from Greg Rakowski's brush pack. If I select that, I really like this one because, as you can see, if I just click it and draw here, it's got, first of all, texture. It's also got color dynamics switched on, and it has a lot of hard edges. So this brush in particular I'm using for detail. And if I want to harden certain edges and stuff, and also create some kind of visual interest. So for example, in this picture here, maybe I want to harden this edge here, where the nose is, or the lack of a nose I should say. Just come in there and select that, kind of just define that a little bit more. And I always go back and forth between these brushes too, so even though I have the process in mind and the brushes that I'm using, it's not really like a hard and fast rule, just what I feel like. Coming back up over here, I don't really think I use anything else for this O'Craig's Run study, though I also do use the mixer brush quite a bit. So the mixer brush acts like a real paintbrush, and I can push and pull the colors on a canvas. You can see it's got some kind of transfer over here, which is super nice. For example, if I start to pull in these colors, you can see how they're actually all mixing together. And I do that a lot in the clouds, which you guys will see later on in the time lapse. But for now, that's just an idea about the brushes that I'm using. I might actually make a video on this in the future and go into even more details, but this is just a really, really quick demonstration. One thing that I tend to do a lot when I'm painting is I flip the canvas in all sorts of directions. This is really just to compare it to my reference and seeing things from a different point of view. And if you guys want to know how to flip the canvas, because I have it bound to a hotkey, I've actually made a video on that which you can check out here. But yeah, really recommend it. It's a really good tool and it makes small inaccuracies that you might have missed pretty obvious. There's also another concept that you can keep in mind when you're painting a landscape, and that's just the idea of fighting the texture monster. So I found this blog post online written by Chris Oatley, which I'll post in the description, and he basically talks about textures when it comes to landscape paintings and the importance of scaling things accurately, and also the amount of detail that you would need to go into certain things. So later on in the time lapse, you'll see that obviously the foreground becomes a lot more detailed, and as things recede, they get less detail, but it becomes complex in a way because things are scaling in the distance. There's a lot of smaller shapes. In the foreground, a lot of things are bigger, like rocks and bushes and twigs and that sort of thing. But in the background, you have to think about the space that's occurring between you and that mountain. So for example, a lot of the trees in the distance go back to what I was saying before with implied detail, and there's a lot of small random shapes. If you zoom in and you actually have a look, it doesn't really look like anything, but in the context of the bigger painting, it starts to make sense. Now we're getting close to the end of the painting, which is always an exciting thing, just seeing it on the horizon. It's almost done. All the work that I put in is starting to pay off, and what I was saying earlier with me having a lot of trouble with this painting, I ended up just taking the rest of the afternoon off one day and came back to it the next morning, and something just clicked. I really don't know what. I think it's just being refreshed and coming back to it with a new set of eyes. A lot of what I was fighting at the start was that canvas having a lot of texture, and I thought it might have helped, but it didn't really. So like I said, I won't try this in the future, but it was a fun experiment anyway. Now that we're getting close though, you'll see me detailing a bunch of trees in the distance, adding more colors, and yes, still this whole time I've been referring to all of my references that I showed you guys earlier. I gotta say though, with the music in the background, this sounds a lot more epic than I expected it to be. Yeah, this has all been really fun so far. There gets a point in every painting where you don't really need to think about picking new colors, and the reason why is because you already have enough colors on the canvas, and especially in Photoshop you can press Alt and use the eyedropper tool and push things and pull things in different directions. At the start though, a lot of the colors that I was choosing were based on my reference, and I don't really like color picking from the reference, so I'm just using it to interpret what kind of range I should be in. And I do want to make a video specifically on color in the future, because personally I think that I have a lot to learn about color, and hopefully if I am able to explain certain things that I'm doing, it will help me understand it a little bit more. But generally, for this image, it's a bit cooler, and so even the warm colors are still on the cooler side. It's handy having coolers up in the top right there. But I can actually divide it in half. See where it is now with that purple? If you draw a 45-degree angle line going top right, that's pretty much the range that I stay in, but as I get closer to the warmer colors, the less saturated it is, and that's just to compensate for the overall coolness that you see. So that little transition there was me not recording for a little while, and that's only because I don't want this time-lapse to be super long, and the video's already getting pretty beefy as it is so far, so thank you if you're still watching. But right now I skipped ahead a couple of hours and we're getting into the final stretch. So, a couple of closing thoughts now. We're getting very close to the end of the painting, and at this point I'm feeling pretty excited to get it all done. In the foreground you can see that I've added a couple of caustic water effects that's going down. That was in my reference, I thought that was pretty cool. And just detailing and detailing and detailing. It's a very repetitive process. Once again, having all of the legwork and the thought process laid out for me earlier on with my thumbnail sketches really helped. And just in a second you'll see how I'm painting that tree in the distance, pulling and pushing different shadow colors into each other and using my textured brushes. I suppose that's probably the best example of implied detail that I can give right now. But yeah, I tend to do that a lot throughout the rest of the painting. Still felt like something was missing from this scene, and that's when I decided to throw in these two fish here, and eventually a couple of birds. At the start, I wasn't entirely sure if they fit the composition, so I asked a friend of mine who he suggested to move it over on the right hand side. Thanks, Brent. And yeah, that's pretty much it. If you've made it this far into the video, I want to thank you for watching the whole way. I hope you guys have learned something. And if you'd like to see more videos from me, then please go down on my channel. You can also follow me at Daniel Ang Art on Instagram. And yeah, till next time, guys.
Yeah, you're right there, boy.